So Maurice and I went to Rome in 1993 after coming up with the idea that governments don't default because in their own currency because all they're doing is spending first and then collecting later, and then the securities function for interest rate maintenance and not to fund the debt, etc. And a paper came out of that called Soft Currency Economics, and afterwards I ran into Randy and Bill and Pavolino. And then they all started looking up the history of these ideas. Okay, so so it's interesting because we came up with the ideas first and then found the history afterwards, which is not necessarily normally the way things work. So we then discovered Lerner, we discovered Knapp, we discovered Innes, and now we've discovered somebody last week, Brummel, is that his name? From 1946, got a reserve president in New York, who said the same thing we've been saying about quantitative easing. So we notice things, we see how they work, and then we go back in history and find reasonably prominent people who said the same thing. Secretary of the Treasury Memminger from the Confederacy said the same thing about how currency worked and explained that's how he was going to set it up. So, so what happens is I think historians who don't know how the currency works don't find these things because they're not looking for them. You have to have enough knowledge of when you're looking at something about circumstances to be able to recognize them as any kind of value. So what's that thing that was found back, the ball with the holes in it, from 4,000 years ago, which they've all said was a means of accounting. It was a clay ball with holes in it where pebbles would fit in. And I'm saying, no, those were used for money because what you do is you have the clay ball and the stone would fit in. When you took it out and you spent it, that would be the thing you accept for taxes. You knew it was the same stone because it fit into that clay ball. Now that's a monetary mechanism. All the record books show that this thing was an accounting mechanism to keep track of things with these stones that you stuck in. So I think history is going to more and more find the things we're talking about.
I think the point about Marshall's talk is very clear, and it's really easy to understand in terms of the public debate now. And the simple way of saying it, not to say that Marshall wasn't exquisite in his oratory, but the simple way of saying it, if you take an economy, you trash about 60 or 70% of its productive capacity, then any spending will start to generate inflation. And if you wanted to avoid hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, then you would have had to have mass deaths of the population through starvation. Private investment would have had to come to virtually a sudden halt because you've just lost all that supply side. So whenever anyone raises at your dinner parties about Zimbabwe, it had nothing to do with demand. It was a supply issue. They trashed their supply. And I know you do in the US, you're doing a pretty good job of trashing your supply at the moment and running down the capacity of your workforce and your industrial structure, but you haven't done it yet. And the companies are still out there. There are still workers who will work for them if there's enough demand for the products. And all you need to do is get the production, your supply side working again. In Zimbabwe, they lost it. It was non-existent. About 60 to 70% was lost. That's why they had hyperinflation.
I'll add something on the Confederacy because it helps to drive home points we've made in every one of these sessions. So yeah, the Secretary of the Treasury was trying to tell the government, look, we need the taxes to support the currency because taxes drive the currency. But the government was saying, well, hold it. We're already putting such a huge burden on our population because they've got to fight the war and we're taking all the resources away from them for the war effort, and we don't want to burden them also with the taxes. Okay? But see, our point is you've got to have the taxes in order to match the resources that you're withdrawing. Okay? It's in real terms. You've got to reduce the demand with the tax system. Okay, and you also have to have a reason why people will accept the currency. And so people would not accept the currency. And that is why they had to just continually print up more and more and more and more.
just add on that point. Okay, that doesn't work. On the point of hyperinflation, so I think the key components here are a supply shock, a tax collection fallout, but also I think you have to have a ratchet. That you could have something that fuels additional expenditure. And in most cases that you observe around the world that have hyperinflation, what was an initial inflationary shock was fueled by some sort of indexation, whether it was of wages or prices. And I think that falling off of the tax base will do that too. But you could fuel it artificially, as opposed to what we were saying earlier, that you have to let inflation dissipate by one mechanism or another through the economy.
Okay, Edward Harrison here again. I have two questions that are unrelated. The first question I had has to do with indexation of retirement benefits, that is Social Security and things of that nature. If you had mentioned that we don't have a very strong labor movement in the United States, but there is an increasing number of retirees, and Social Security is effectively indexed to the inflation rate. So how does that play into the situation?
Just quickly, if it causes a shortage of real resources because the seniors are getting all the food, are getting all the housing, and there's not enough left for anyone else, then it's a real problem that has to be addressed. It's not there yet, but that's certainly a possibility, that we could over-provision a sector of the population and have to make adjustments.
Yeah, I agree. It could be inflationary in the future. Indexing wages passes through a lot more quickly because wages are a cost. And so as wages go up, the prices have to go up. Okay, but with Social Security, yeah, it's once we get to full employment and high level of aggregate demand, which could be the case 20 years from now when we have, well, most of the people in this room are going to be retired on Social Security.
Now, the second unrelated question I had to do with what happened, the hyperinflation scenarios. Now, in terms of a country that issues its debt, has a sovereign currency, we were talking about the outcomes as being inflation or currency depreciation. Now, a lot of people talk about a third outcome, which is interest rates increasing. And my question on this is to the degree that the central bank really could go into the market and buy up any sort of securities that it wanted to, obviously that would control interest rates. However, aren't interest rates a question in regards to currency depreciation, imported inflation via currency depreciation? So just to sort of just make it more plain, what I'm saying is if the currency goes down, the price of oil and other imported goods goes up, that creates inflation, and as a result of that inflation and also the currency depreciation, you would normally expect interest rates to rise.
Okay, but interest rates are set politically by the Federal Reserve. So unless that's part of the reaction function, they're not going to go up, right? So you have the Bank of Japan's had rates at 0 for 20 years. And then
they set the short-term rate, but the long-term rate is effectively the imputed federal funds rate going forward.
Right. But let me suggest they also can set the long rate if they want to.
That's what I just said in terms of going in and doing so. But that's an ideological, a political decision.
Right. So they could say Fed funds are going to stay at 0 for 10 years, and then the 10-year will be at 0.
Right. So I personally, I find that that sort of intervention not something I would support, and I guarantee you that lots of other people wouldn't support that either. So I think that that's a political problem. The concept of the Federal Reserve going out the yield curve and then setting rates.
Okay, and the Treasury does the opposite when it issues along. It's setting rates higher than otherwise. So either way, the government is setting long-term rates. Now, either by default or by active policy. Or lack of it. The other thing is, and I'm going to venture off into theory here, we've been in operational fact, But I see a lot of reason to believe that the zero rates are actually deflationary, not inflationary. Because again, Japan has a very strong currency after all these years. And so you look for the channels where zero rates would be deflationary rather than inflationary. One is on the supply side, because the cost of inventory is very low, so you don't get the kind of bottlenecks, and it keeps the cost of production and new investment down by having a zero rate policy. So you have positive supply side effects. On the demand side, it takes all the nations are net savers, and the larger the budget deficit, the larger the net savers. So lower rates reduce income directly. And the other thing that tends to happen is bank net interest margins tend to grow as rates go down, which transfers income from savers with some reasonably high marginal propensity to consume to banks that have zero propensity to consume, and reduces interest income. So through the interest income channels, there seems to be, I have a lot of reason to think that zero interest rates are actually deflationary. And if you look at currencies that have zero interest rates, such as the UMKC buckaroos and my cards that I tell you you'd have to get out the door, paying interest on buckaroos is not going to increase the value from $5, from $15 to $20. We know where the value comes from. It comes from the monopolist setting price. And the currency is a public monopoly. And at the end of the day, the value of the currency is what you have to do to get it from the monopolist, from the government. So, in other words, the price level is necessarily a function of prices paid by the government when it spends, at the point of spending. And spending policies have a whole lot more to do with the price level than anything else. There are two ways for monopolists to spend. One is at market prices, and the other is on a price-constrained basis. And an example of that would be if you have the electric monopoly for the city of Washington. You could say, okay, it's 10 cents a kilowatt and let supply adjust, or you could say we're going to sell 2 billion kilowatts at the market and let the market determine price. A monopolist always sets price and lets quantity adjust. With a currency monopoly, we do the opposite. We set the budget and we let price adjust. Well, of course it's going to be chaotic like it is. But we have the ability to set price and let quantity adjust. In other words, just be on the bid side of the market and not pay the offered side. And that's where Bill's, JG, and Randy's ELR comes in, where in a market economy you only need to set one price. In this case, it's the price of unskilled labor. And we can get into that later. I think it's called.
Well, if I keep talking, I'll stay awake. So there's just a couple of points I'd make, and Ed, your first premise is disputable. It's the premise that's always wheeled out, but it's not necessarily inevitable. First of all, a depreciation in the currency is not inflation. It's a once-off price adjustment, in as much as import prices are weighted in your CPI, or whatever your measure of inflation is. It's just a once-off. For that to become inflationary, there has to be some secondary effects where the participants in the real income distribution don't agree to share the real income loss. Yeah. So a depreciation isn't inflation. That's a myth. It's a myth that's commonly put out there.
Almost naturally mean that
It doesn't naturally do anything. All it
sources, that is the price of oil, as an example, the price of natural gas, wood.
there's a real income loss to the economy.
Yeah, that's a one-time shift.
It's a one-time real income loss.
That's the definition of inflation.
Yeah, that's the first point. But the second point is that no, a once-off adjustment in a price level is not inflation. That's the myth. Inflation is a continuous increase in the price level. So you can have adjustments in Australia in July 2000. We brought in a 10% GST, a value-added tax. And all it did for about... No, I'm arguing the reality. All that happened in Australia when we put a 10% impost, hold on, all that happened was for 2 quarters the measured CPI jumped up, and then that was it. once-off adjustment. No,
So it's a definitional issue.
no, that's the point I'm making. It's one of the myths out there. And
We'll call it that, but that's
it's one of the myths out there that should be addressed. The second point is that there's no intrinsic or inevitable relationship between a deficit position of government and the exchange rate. All the empirical work shows that there's no systematic relationship between the fiscal balance and the exchange rate. And it's quite plausible that you could have a strengthening exchange rate with very large deficits as a percentage of GDP if those deficits were creating conditions that allowed the capital account to improve. And if you really want to think about a country with, and I think Warren mentioned it, with a very strong currency and huge public debt, the highest in the world, and ongoing relatively large deficits. Think about Japan. They haven't had any systematic meltdown in their currency. They've had deflation all of those years.
Well, they did go to 150 to the U.S. dollar at one particular juncture in time, and they wanted to do that, in fact. So given the fact they're at 94 to the U.S. dollar and they were at 150, you could say that that's a 50% reduction in the real income of the people who live in that country relative to everyone else. And as a result, you would expect, therefore, people would be upset by that.
You're right, but don't forget it was an active policy of intervention to push it up to 150, and then when they stopped intervening, it got strong again. It didn't get weak on its own. They had to push it up.
Can I try a different way of responding? Because let's put it in the framework of how does the central bank tend to react to inflation and currency depreciation? I think that you're correct that they do tend to raise the interest rate because they accept two what we're calling myths. One is that if you raise interest rates, that fights inflation, and that they should fight inflation that could result from currency depreciation and rising price of the commodities that you import, for example. Because raising interest rates is going to increase government spending on interest. And so you might actually stimulate the economy thinking you're going to slow it down to fight inflation. And then the second belief is that raising interest rates helps your currency to appreciate. And what Bill is telling you, there are no variables out there that economists have ever been able to find that are correlated with the currencies. There is no model that works. So there actually is no evidence that raising your interest rate appreciates your currency. And as Bill is saying, there's no evidence that budget deficits are correlated with currency depreciation. Just plot the U.S. budget deficit against our currency, and there just isn't any correlation. Sometimes currency appreciates with a budget deficit. Sometimes it appreciates with a budget surplus. There just isn't a correlation for this. But yes, I agree with you. Central banks think this way. And so these are myths we have to try to dispel.
Yeah, I mean, the example in Australia, we were running massive record surpluses, and our exchange rate went down to 49 cents US. And these characters here used to call us the half-price country. And now I'm here to advise you that you're now very cheap to come here, and you're getting cheaper by the day, and we're running huge deficits.
We may not be visiting you in December.
We have a question over here. Dennis Kelleher, Rebel Capitalist. I have a hypothetical question. I don't know if I should have disclosed that, but let's assume that a government had gained or has been enlightened and started practicing modern monetary operations and understanding it, and the link between wage growth and productivity was restored. What impact or potential impact would that have on inflation? Thank you.
Which link is that? Pardon? Which link specifically?
The wage,
You mean
right now,
establishing cost of living, COLA adjustments and things like
wage
that?
growth, for years we had a linkage between wage growth and productivity. When worker productivity increased, wage grew with that. Sometime in late 70s or 80s, that was completely separate. So now we have productivity skyrocketing, wage growth stagnating. So
It's the
let's
same,
assume,
the world over. And the empirical studies have never been able to come up with a systematic relationship between wage share movements, which is what you're really talking about, because the wage share is just the ratio of the real wage to labour productivity. And that clearly in all countries has diverged in the, depending where you start, but in the 80s and 90s clearly. And it's never been prior to that, you had very close correspondence with that. And I mean, that was in a way the capitalists, if you like the terminology, they were smart enough to realise that you had to have someone to buy the stuff. And in the 80s and 90s, they worked out a different way, and that was to load the workers up with debt and get a double whammy, steal the productivity in the first place, and then load them up with debt so they could still realise the production. But we didn't have major inflation breakouts in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, when there was an extremely close correspondence in all of our countries between real wage growth and productivity growth. The wage share in Australia used to be 62%, now it's 51%. And that's been a systematic erosion of workers' entitlements. And when it was 62% for years, I mean, Nicholas Caldor used to call it one of the stylised facts, the constancy of the wage share. And it was only in this neoliberal era that is no longer a stylised fact. We saw no inflation during those periods. Inflation occurs if expenditure, nominal demand growth, outstrips the real capacity of the economy to respond to that.
Or the price shock.
What's that? Or a supply price shock that's not isolated from the distributional system. And it's quite possible that if workers are enjoying, in Australia we've had a system of national arbitration, national wage determination, like a Scandinavian system. And it's always considered that real wage productivity growth provides the real space for nominal wage adjustments. And as long as the real wages don't grow faster than productivity growth, you're unlikely to get nominal demand outstripping real capacity. And the only way you could actually get ongoing aggregate demand growth that will engage your real capacity without indebting your household sector is to make sure real wages do grow in line with productivity growth.
This isn't working. You know the game theory story? It's working. The other thing is, it's a basic mainstream game model. Games first week of games. Game theory tells you that the labor market, whatever that is anyway, isn't a fair game because people have to work to eat, and business only hires if they feel they can make a acceptable rate of profit, right? So the idea is, as the unemployment goes down, then people who are left unemployed, their bargaining power goes up and they're able to negotiate higher wages. So therefore, as we get to lower, there are productivity differences also, but it's also the fact is, if you're the last guy waiting for a job and everybody else has one, and you're offered a job and you don't take it, you're still going to starve. Okay, so you don't have any more bargaining power because the unemployment pool is lower. And we saw unemployment fall below 4% in the late 90s, even with core inflation coming down. So that whole idea that there's this Nehru, et cetera, I don't see the support for it either in the data or in mainstream theory itself, where once you just take a look at rudimentary game theory, there's no reason to expect real wages to do anything except stagnate unless there's some kind of support, either through some kind of Australian type of thing or some kind of support to make it more of at least make it more of a fair game.
Hi, I'm Bryce Covert. I'm with New Deal 2.0, and my apologies if this has already been touched upon. I'm not an economist, so I'm not following everything. But it seems like the danger that you do admit to spending is inflation. You had that warning, and you're talking about it a little bit now. I understand, the differences between the hyperinflation of Zimbabwe and Weimar Germany, but, in the U.S., how much of a risk do we have of that, and are there things that should be done or can be done to prevent inflation that we're not doing? Are we going to run that risk, or do you think we're pretty safe?
Let me just say, I think we're very safe, but the risks of inflation are political, they're not economic. If we're wrong and inflation goes up to 4 or 5% when we thought it was going to go to 1 or 2, we don't lose any wealth as a nation. We might lose at the ballot box, but we don't lose anything in terms of employment and output. And in fact, most studies show it's more likely to improve things, okay? And we don't get hurt in terms of investment or anything else like that. Again, studies show that it helps those things. But you do lose at the ballot box. So we do come up with policies that will cater to what voters want and how voters feel good about living their lives.
I'll make an additional point. Jamie Galbraith makes this point very well. I've seen him make it a number of times. And he talks about the asymmetry of risk. And he simply says that, look, if you don't spend enough, there's a major danger of a relapse. And that's coming at a time we already have, officially 9.5% unemployment, but by any honest measure, it's closer to 20%. You have very high debt levels in the U.S. You still have an ongoing housing crisis. So that's you have a significance of the possibility of a significant relapse, 1937 style, if you don't spend enough. Now, if you spend too much, what's the risk? Well, you'll get fuller employment. You'll get a lot more capacity being used, and you might eventually get inflation. Okay, you get the inflation. You can solve that through a tax. It's a very easy problem to solve. Or you simply stop spending, or equally like the automatic stabilizers start taking care of themselves. The economy begins to grow again. More revenues come into the government. Social welfare expenditures come down. So that in itself will start to create a fiscal drag on the economy. So it seems to me that the risks are so stunningly asymmetric in regard to not spending, and that can be done either through direct government spending or by massively cutting taxes. That if I was a trader making a bet right now, inflation, deflation bet, I think it's still heavily weighted towards the deflation side for all the reasons I've outlined.
See, we really need to get into what we mean by inflation, and we need to distinguish between different things that might cause prices to increase, even sustained price increases. So Keynes had this definition, true inflation. True inflation only occurs when aggregate demand is too high. That is, where you've already fully employed your resources and you continue to increase spending. That is true inflation. And the way to fight that is by reducing aggregate demand. So that is when you need to raise taxes, cut government spending, or somehow get the private sector to stop spending. Maybe clamp down on banks so they can't lend, so people can't borrow and spend. Okay, that's how you fight that. Now, what happens if you have an oil price shock? Do you fight that by reducing demand? No, that would not make any sense. You have to find another method. Now, as Bill keeps alluding to, in the kinds of institutional arrangements we have in the United States, an oil price inflation is going to end itself very quickly because we don't have very much indexing of wages in our society or of government spending in our society that is going to cause an oil price shock to lead to a wage price spiral or something like that. But we could have those, and if we did, then the way to fight that is through institutional change, not by clamping down on aggregate demand. You want to change the institutions. Maybe centralized wage bargaining would be a way to do it, and figure out how you're going to share the costs of adjusting to higher oil prices. Okay? So we really need to identify why we got the inflation. If it's because the currency is depreciating, again, in the United States, this isn't very plausible. In a country like Mexico, they have very high feed-through impacts of currency depreciation into rising prices. So they've got to deal with that problem, something that we don't have to deal with. And then finally, what everyone is talking about is the current outlook, the current situation in the United States. It's just about impossible to identify a way that we could get inflation going, even if we wanted to. And this is where Japan has been for a very long time. Okay, we have to remember that we just had 2 billion people come into the market economy, and they all want to produce stuff and sell it to us. And they're willing to work at very low wages, and their firms are willing to sell at very low prices. It's just not a plausible argument. Even if we got closer to full employment, that we're going to get significant inflation pressures. Other than, yes, commodities prices could go up and we could have a very short-term increase of prices, which is what Bill was trying to get to. That's not inflation, but it is going to cause a redistribution of income. You want to say something briefly?
I think it's really telling that, and it's sort of a bit of, it's building on Warren's point, that we are always talking about inflation threats when you've got, maybe, I'm not sure, in America it's about 17.2% currently, you use 6 measures. In Australia it's 13.2%. In some countries, in Spain, it's at least 30% once you add in underemployment of your labour resources unemployed. And we're worried about inflation. I mean, one of the greatest successes of the neoliberal period has been able to convince us, and it relates to, Marshall said that, you know, the risks are just asymmetric. Well, so are the costs. The costs of unemployment dwarf any other economic costs you can possibly identify. And this goes back to a famous interchange between the American economists Arnold Harberger and Arthur Oken. And I think it was Tobin who said it, yes? How many Harberger triangles can you fit into one Oken gap? And for non-economists, the Harberger triangles were these measures of inefficiencies, microeconomic inefficiencies, of the sort that you might get with some inflation. And the Oken gap was the lost output from having unemployment above full employment. And the answer to the question, how many of these microeconomic inefficiency measures can you fit into one macroeconomic inefficiency measure? The answer is lots. And the point about it is that the macro costs of unemployment and lost income, and then all of the related social pathologies and intergenerational pathologies that follow, are massive. And you're sitting here in this country, in my country and other countries, idly sitting by, wasting forever billions of dollars of income generation every day. And the only thing you can come up with is worrying about inflation. Even if inflation was a risk, I wouldn't worry about it right now, because the relative costs are just not even commensurate. And that's the big success of the neoliberal era, to get us to disabuse us of the notion that unemployment is a cost and unemployment should be a policy target. We now, under our central banking inflation targeting and inflation first type policy emphasis, we now use unemployment as a policy tool. We're now using the most costly pathology of market-based economies as a tool to discipline something that is nowhere near the scale of cost. And that's the success of the neoliberal era. And it's a damn shame.
You're giving our presentation.
Sorry.
Fair to say that the lost output in the last 2 years is more than the cost of every war countries ever fought.
Yeah, the massive. Every day.
Can you hear me? Testing.
It's probably fair to say that the losses from unemployment over the last 2 years, just in terms of lost output, are far higher than all the costs of all the wars the U.S. has ever fought in its history combined. Seriously. Well, that's just gone forever. You know, plus the ongoing losses, because it's all path dependent. Once you change your path, you've lost it. You know, the growth rates have to be much higher to get back onto path.
Yeah, millions and millions of dollars a day. Every day our countries are foregoing. Millions of dollars a day. Inflation will never go anywhere near that.
Well, if we have 20% unemployment, I know not everybody's equally valuable, but it wouldn't surprise me if the losses are 20% of GDP every year, or something close to it.
Maybe that's the
huge
graph
numbers.
we need.
Yeah. Well, the output gap. So what they do is when they compute the output gap is they assume some minimum level of unemployment for inflation control. So even the output gaps, which are huge now, are far underestimate what the actual output gap is if they didn't have that artificial constraint of 5% unemployment for what they call the Nehru, and now they're talking about moving that up to 6 and 7 and 8%. Where Europe's been at 9 for how long? Forever, right? 10, yeah.
I think it was Keynes who used the example of paying people to dig ditches and then paying other people to fill them up again. And I always thought it was curious that it was politically acceptable to discuss something as useless as that in a serious idea. And I gathered that one of the reasons for that is that the thought of government paying people to do something useful which would compete with the private sector is kind of what makes you go into that sort of nonsense realm. And basically what I'm thinking is that there is a sort of minimum profit margin that the private sector demands, and they don't want government competing and employing people and lowering their profit margins. And where I'm going with this is that we have repealed the laws against usury and made profit margins in certain financial endeavors very, very high, and everything pales in comparison. People who would become engineers instead become bond traders. And if we're ever going to focus people on doing useful work at perhaps lower margins, don't we have to get a handle on usury?
I'll be the first to say that the financial sector is, by and large, a total waste of human endeavor. But I'll let Randy. My tagline is the financial sector is a lot more trouble than it's worth. But I'll let Randy comment on putting Keynes in context. Yeah. But the other thing is the size of government is a political choice and how much we want, and it's there for public infrastructure. Digging holes and filling them in is not public infrastructure. And go ahead and put Keynes in context.
Yeah, of course, he was being sarcastic. He's saying, if you guys are so stupid you can't think of anything useful for these people to do, we could at least hire them to dig holes and bury money. So that wasn't his proposal. He wanted to hire people to do useful things. And let me just tell you, the next panel we're going to talk about the job creation program, and so the people will do useful things. But the other thing is they won't compete with the private sector. Okay, you want to ensure that they won't compete with the private sector. You want to complement the private sector. So I just want to clear that up, but that will be addressed in the next panel.
Do you have any notion that repealing the laws against usury is part of the problem?
Well, of course, what Keynes wanted was full employment and euthanasia of the rentier. Okay, euthanasia of the rentier. He wanted to drive the overnight interest rate down to zero, and I think many of us up here support that. And I think that is a way to put finance back into its place. It's only part of the answer. Okay, so downsizing finance, we agree with you. Well, I think we all agree with you. Probably all of us.
So that's a stop